It was a sunny afternoon when Laura Reynolds, a 6-month pregnant woman, decided to take a walk to clear her mind. Her husband, Marcus, an FBI agent, had been working a long shift, and she hoped to surprise him with a home-cooked dinner when he returned. The streets were calm, and the warm sun made everything feel peaceful. Little did she know, that simple walk would soon turn into a nightmare. As Laura strolled down the street, enjoying the fresh air, a police car drove by. The officer inside, Officer Thompson, glanced over and saw her walking alone. Something about her caught his attention, and he immediately decided to stop the car. He didn't know why, but he felt the need to approach her. Laura noticed the car slowing down and felt a sense of unease, but she brushed it off. After all, she hadn't done anything wrong. However, as soon as the car stopped beside her, the officer stepped out and approached her in an aggressive manner. His voice was stern as he demanded, "What are you doing out here?" Taken off guard, Laura tried to remain calm. "I'm just going for a walk," she explained, offering a friendly smile. "I'm pregnant, and I needed some fresh air." The officer, however, wasn't satisfied with her answer. "You look suspicious," he said, his tone cold and accusatory. He began asking her questions about her identity and why she was walking alone in that particular area. Laura was confused. She had walked this route many times before, and nothing had ever happened. She tried to explain again that she was just a woman going for a walk, but Officer Thompson didn't listen. He suddenly grabbed her arm, pulling her towards the police car. "You're not going anywhere until I figure out what's going on here," he growled. Laura's heart began to race. She wasn't sure what was happening or why she was being treated this way. She looked around for help, but the street was empty. The officer's grip on her arm tightened, and she instinctively pulled away. "Please let go of me," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm pregnant, and I don't want to cause any trouble." But the officer wasn't listening. His aggression only grew. He pulled her toward the car with more force, causing Laura to stumble. The pain in her stomach made her gasp, and her eyes welled with tears. She couldn't believe this was happening. She had done nothing wrong. Before she could say anything else, Laura's phone rang. It was Marcus. Laura, panicking, quickly answered the call. "Marcus, please, there's an officer here, and he's not letting me go," she explained, her voice trembling. Marcus, already concerned after hearing her voice, immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. "Stay calm, Laura. I'm on my way," he said, trying to reassure her. Laura could only hope that Marcus would get there in time. She was terrified for her safety and that of her unborn child. Meanwhile, Officer Thompson continued to be rough with her, ignoring her repeated requests to be released. As she struggled, she realized that this wasn't just about a simple police stop. Something was deeply wrong here. She had seen officers before, but none had ever treated her like this, especially not for simply taking a walk. Unbeknownst to Officer Thompson, the woman he had stopped wasn't just any ordinary person. Laura's husband was Marcus Reynolds, an FBI agent with years of experience dealing with dangerous situations. As he rushed to her location, his mind was racing, and his heart beat faster. He knew the power of the badge, and he had no idea just how much power the situation was about to give him. He could already feel the weight of what was happening, but he wasn't prepared for what he would find when he arrived. As Laura struggled with Officer Thompson's grip, she tried to stay calm, even though fear was starting to take over. The officer wasn't listening to her pleas, and the pain in her stomach was becoming unbearable. Every time he pulled her, she could feel her baby moving uncomfortably, and her anxiety grew. The officer's harsh voice filled the air, but all she could focus on was the pain and the fear of what might happen next. "Let go of me," she cried, her voice shaking with desperation. "I haven't done anything wrong." But Officer Thompson was relentless. "You're not going anywhere until I figure out what's going on with you," he repeated, his grip tightening. Laura was now feeling helpless. She wished Marcus were there, But she couldn't afford to waste time thinking about that. She had to stay strong, for herself and for her child. Just as the officer began to move her toward the patrol car, Laura heard the sound of footsteps approaching quickly. She could feel the tension in the air shift as a familiar voice rang out. "Officer, stop right there." It was Marcus. Laura's heart skipped a beat at the sound of his voice. She looked up, and there he was, striding toward them with a look of determination. Dressed in his FBI suit, he looked every bit the agent he was. But as he got closer, Laura could see the anger and worry in his eyes, emotion she had never seen him show so openly before. Officer Thompson stopped in his tracks, surprised by the unexpected interruption. "What's this?" he sneered, raising an eyebrow. "Do you know her?" Marcus didn't hesitate for a second. "Yes, she's my wife," he said, his voice firm. But there was a more important part of the truth that Marcus didn't share right away. He didn't just know her. He was trained to handle situations exactly like this. Laura could see the officer's face go pale. The realization hit him hard, but it didn't take him long to recover. He quickly pulled away from Laura, his eyes now shifting nervously. "I didn't know she was your wife," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then why are you treating her like this?" Marcus demanded, his voice rising. "She's pregnant, and you have no right to put your hands on her like that. You had no cause to even stop her." The officer tried to avoid eye contact, unsure of what to say. His posture seemed to soften, but Marcus could tell that the officer's arrogance was still strong. He could sense that the situation was not over, and he wasn't about to let it slide. "I was just doing my job," Officer Thompson muttered, though it was clear he wasn't in control anymore. "Your job?" Marcus shot back. "Your job is to protect and serve, not intimidate and harm innocent people. You had no right to grab her like that. And don't think I won't be following up on this." The tension was palpable now, with the officer standing rigid and Marcus stepping closer. Laura was still shaken by the ordeal, but seeing her husband stand up for her gave her a sense of relief. This wasn't just any situation. Marcus wasn't just her husband. He was a trained professional, and this officer had just crossed a line. Laura watched as the officer seemed to shrink under Marcus's gaze. She could tell that he knew this wasn't a situation he could walk away from easily. "I'll be speaking to your superiors about this," Marcus continued, his voice cold. "And you will be held accountable for what you've done." At that moment, Laura felt a sense of empowerment. She wasn't just a woman on the street. She wasn't just a pregnant wife in distress. She had someone who would protect her, someone who knew the system and the law better than anyone. And she wasn't alone anymore. But as Officer Thompson backed away, the weight of the situation started to settle in. This wasn't just an ordinary day anymore. It was going to change everything. And Marcus knew that even though the officer had backed off, the real battle was only just beginning. As the officer walked away, his eyes were still locked on Marcus, and there was a slight hesitation in his step. The damage had been done, but he had no choice but to retreat. The situation had taken a sharp turn, and the last thing he wanted was for things to escalate any further, especially not with someone as influential as Marcus standing in front of him. Marcus helped Laura to her feet, his hand steady as he gently supported her. She had felt helpless moments before, but now with him beside her, a sense of calm began to wash over her. She could see the tension in Marcus's face, but he was already thinking about the next steps. "You okay?" Marcus asked softly, his voice full of concern. Laura nodded, though she still felt shaken by what had just happened. The shock of the officer's actions was still sinking in, but knowing Marcus was there for her made all the difference. He wrapped an arm around her and led her away from the street, toward a quieter corner. "I'm fine," Laura said, though her voice trembled slightly. "But I don't understand what happened. Why did he stop me? Why did he treat me like that?" Marcus gave her a reassuring smile, but there was a clear determination in his eyes. "It doesn't matter. What matters now is that you're safe. We're going to handle this, Laura. I won't let anyone treat you like that again." Laura nodded again, feeling the support of her husband, but her thoughts were still heavy. She knew this wasn't going to end here. Marcus had seen too much in his career not to know the reality of how situations like this could spiral out of control. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. It was one thing to treat people like this in a controlled environment, but to abuse power like that in the open, he couldn't just let it go. "What are you going to do?" Laura asked, sensing the storm brewing within Marcus. "I'm going to make sure that officers' actions are reported. I won't stand for this kind of behavior." He paused, letting the weight of the words hang in the air. "It's not just about you, Laura. It's about making sure that no one else is ever put in this position again." Laura could see the fire in Marcus's eyes, and it made her proud. She knew that this wouldn't be easy, but Marcus wasn't the type to back down from what was right. "Do you think he'll get in trouble?" she asked, trying to understand what the next steps would be. Marcus sighed. "I'm not sure, but I'm going to make sure it gets looked at. I know the system, and I won't let it sweep this under the rug." As they stood there, Marcus's mind raced with thoughts of how he would take action. He knew it wasn't just about making a phone call. It was about making sure that people who were supposed to protect others were held accountable when they misused their power. He had to be strategic. There was no room for mistakes when it came to something like this. Laura was quiet for a moment, taking in everything. She could see how much this situation had affected Marcus, but she also felt a deep sense of appreciation for how much he cared. This wasn't just a personal matter. It was about righting a wrong that affected everyone. And as much as she wanted to put it behind them, she knew the journey ahead would be challenging. "Let's go home, Marcus," Laura said, her voice softer now, though she could still feel the weight of the moment. "But I want us to take action. I want to be part of this change too." Marcus smiled and kissed her forehead. "You're already part of it," he said. "Together, we'll make sure this doesn't happen again." The two of them walked hand in hand, knowing that while this was just one step in the fight, it was a fight they were both ready to face. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but together, they could make a difference. The next few days passed in a blur for Marcus and Laura. After the incident with the officer, they knew they had to act quickly. Marcus wasted no time in contacting his colleagues at the FBI and made sure that the situation was taken seriously. He couldn't let what had happened to Laura be forgotten. It was a moment that could not be swept under the rug. Marcus had spent years working in law enforcement and knew how the system worked. He understood the frustrations that often came with trying to hold people accountable, especially when it involved someone from within the same system. But this time was different. He wasn't just trying to make sure that the right thing was done for a stranger. This time, it was personal. He arranged a meeting with his superiors to discuss the next steps. Sitting in the room with other members of law enforcement, Marcus could feel the weight of the situation. He had always been the one to stand up for justice, but this time it felt more complicated. Not only was it a question of standing up for his wife, but it was also about making sure that no one else would suffer from the same kind of treatment. "Marcus, I understand your concerns," said one of the senior officers. "But you know how things like this can play out. We have to make sure we're handling this carefully." Marcus clenched his jaw, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I don't care about handling it carefully," he replied firmly. "What happened wasn't just an error. It was abuse of power, and we can't allow that to happen. Not to my wife, not to anyone." The room fell silent for a moment as Marcus's words hung in the air. He could see the tension in the eyes of his colleagues. Some understood what he was saying, but others were hesitant to take a stand. They knew how complicated it could be to go against a fellow officer, especially in a small town where everyone knew everyone else. "Marcus, you've always been someone we can count on," said another officer. "But we need more than just your word. We need proof. We need witnesses." Marcus nodded. "I know. I'm not going to let it end here. I'll gather everything I can. We have to make sure this officer is held accountable." After the meeting, Marcus reached out to Laura, telling her what had happened. He explained that it was going to take some time, but they were going to get the evidence they needed to move forward. Laura, as strong as always, gave him a quiet but supportive nod. "I trust you," she said softly. "I know this isn't easy, but we're doing the right thing." Later that day, Marcus and Laura went to the police department to file an official report. It wasn't something they'd ever thought they'd have to do, but they knew it was necessary. As they stood in front of the officer's desk, Marcus felt a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about their family anymore. This was about making sure no one else had to go through what Laura had experienced. While Marcus was working with the department, Laura took the time to talk to people in the community. She knew that their story had to be shared, not just to bring justice for them, but to inspire others who might be in similar situations. She found that there were other people who had faced unfair treatment by officers, but they hadn't spoken up. People need to know they have a voice, Laura told Marcus one evening as they sat together. "We can't let fear stop us from doing the right thing." Marcus agreed. Together, they began to create a support network, bringing attention to the issue of police abuse and how it affected so many lives. It was hard, but they were determined to make sure their voices were heard. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. Marcus and Laura were ready to fight, not just for their family, but for justice. This was the beginning of a long journey, and they were committed to seeing it through, no matter what obstacles lay in their path. The days that followed the meeting with his colleagues at the FBI were filled with a mix of determination and uncertainty. Marcus and Laura were not about to let the incident with the officer slide. Their fight for justice had just begun, but it wasn't easy. They had to be patient, gather evidence, and face an uphill battle against the very system that was supposed to protect them. Marcus was determined to hold the officer accountable. He knew it wouldn't be simple. The law enforcement community was a tight-knit group, and it wasn't unusual for officers to close ranks when one of their own was accused of wrongdoing. But Marcus was different. He wasn't just an officer. He was a husband and a father, and he was determined to protect his family and the community. Laura, too, was playing her part. Though she had been shaken by the experience, she had a quiet strength that inspired Marcus every day. She spent her days meeting with lawyers, gathering witnesses, and doing everything she could to help their case. The support she found in her community was heartwarming, but she knew that facing the officer in court would be emotionally difficult. Still, she was resolute. "It's not just about us," Laura told Marcus one evening. "It's about making sure it doesn't happen again. If we don't speak up, who will?" Her words resonated with Marcus. It wasn't just about seeking justice for what had happened to her. It was about standing up for others who had been mistreated, who might not have the strength or resources to fight back. As the days passed, they began to receive support from a surprising place. Other police officers, who were aware of the incident and its impact, came forward with their own stories. Some admitted to witnessing what had happened that day, while others shared experiences of their own, where things hadn't been right within the force. These officers were scared, but they knew that Marcus and Laura were doing the right thing. One officer, a veteran who had worked in the department for over 20 years, reached out to Marcus. "I've seen things," the officer confessed, "but I didn't know who to trust. What happened to your wife was wrong, and it shouldn't have happened. I'll stand by you." Marcus was humbled by the officer's courage. He had always believed in justice, but this was the kind of support he had hoped for, the kind that came from people willing to take a stand, even when it was hard. But there was also resistance. Some officers in the department were not happy about the attention Marcus and Laura were bringing to the situation. They didn't want their community to know about the darker side of law enforcement, and they didn't want to risk their reputation. There were murmurs, backroom discussions, and some subtle attempts to silence the truth. One evening, Marcus and Laura sat in their living room, exhausted but resolute. They knew the fight wasn't going to be easy, and they were prepared for the long haul. "We can't let them get away with this," Marcus said, his voice filled with determination. I don't care how many officers don't want to stand up. We will." Laura placed a hand on his shoulder. "We have to keep going, Marcus. We have to show everyone that change is possible. This isn't just about us. It's about creating a safer world for our children, for everyone." The fight was far from over, and they both knew it. But with every step they took, they were making progress. They were not only seeking justice for the wrong done to Laura, but also opening up a conversation about accountability within law enforcement. The road ahead would be filled with challenges. But Marcus and Laura were not afraid. They had each other, and they had a community that was beginning to rally around them. They had become symbols of hope and change, and with that, their resolve grew stronger. Together, they were determined to make sure their story, and the stories of others like them, were not forgotten. The day of the court hearing finally arrived. Marcus and Laura stood side by side as they walked into the courthouse, both feeling a mixture of nervousness and determination. The courtroom was filled with people who had come to witness what they hoped would be a turning point in their fight for justice. News of the case had spread, and the support they had received from the community was overwhelming. As they entered the courtroom, the defense attorney for the officer was already seated, looking confident and prepared. The officer himself was there too, seated in the defendant's chair, appearing calm, almost detached from the gravity of the situation. Marcus took a deep breath as he glanced at Laura. This was the moment they had been preparing for, and they both knew it would be challenging. The judge called the court to order, and the proceedings began. The prosecution started by presenting the evidence they had gathered. Photos, witness statements, and a video of the incident that had been taken by a bystander were all shown. The video clearly depicted the officer's actions, his aggressive approach to Laura, and the way he had taken the inhaler from her, ignoring her distress. It was a powerful moment. Laura had to fight back tears as the video played. She could hear her own voice, pleading for the officer to return her inhaler, but all she could focus on was the pain she had felt in that moment. Marcus held her hand tightly, offering her silent support. He knew this was hard for her, but he also knew that what they were doing was important. When it was time for Marcus to testify, he stood tall, his voice steady as he spoke about the events of that day. He explained how he had tried to protect Laura, how he had been powerless in the face of the officer's aggression. He described the emotional toll it had taken on both of them, and how it had affected their lives since that day. The defense attorney tried to discredit Marcus's testimony, claiming that he was simply angry and upset, and that his version of events was biased. But Marcus stood his ground. He didn't back down, and he didn't allow the defense to manipulate the truth. He was there to tell the world what had happened, and he was determined to make sure that everyone knew the officer's actions were wrong. As the trial went on, more witnesses came forward. Some were other officers who had seen the incident, and others were people who had been in the area that day. Each testimony painted a clearer picture of the officer's misconduct. It was becoming more and more difficult for the defense to argue that what had happened was anything less than a blatant abuse of power. Finally, it was time for the officer to speak. He took the stand, his face pale and strained. His story was inconsistent, and his attempt to justify his actions only made things worse. He claimed that he had been acting out of concern for the safety of Laura and her unborn child, but no one in the courtroom was buying it. The evidence was clear, and it was evident that the officer had acted out of anger and prejudice, not concern. As the trial came to a close, the judge called for a short recess before delivering the verdict. Marcus and Laura sat in silence, holding hands, waiting for the decision. They knew that the case had been strong, but they also knew that justice wasn't always guaranteed. When the court reconvened, the judge read the verdict aloud. The officer was found guilty of misconduct, and the courtroom erupted in applause. Marcus and Laura exchanged a look of relief and pride. This was the moment they had been fighting for, the moment that had taken all their strength and courage to achieve. As they walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the decision finally settled on them. They had won. But more importantly, they had made a statement that would resonate far beyond the walls of that courtroom. They had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, they had shown that justice could prevail, even in the face of adversity. Their journey wasn't over, but they had taken a significant step toward healing and toward creating a better, safer world for others. Marcus and Laura had shown the world that, no matter the odds, they would never stop fighting for what was right. After weeks of tension, the day of the hearing finally arrived. Marcus and Laura stood side by side, feeling a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. This was the moment they had been working toward, and it had taken everything they had to get to this point. The courthouse was buzzing with energy as reporters filled the seats and community members gathered in support. This case was bigger than just them. It was about justice, equality, and holding people accountable for their actions. The courtroom was tense as the proceedings began. The prosecutor outlined the facts. The officer's unprovoked aggression toward Laura, his refusal to listen to her pleas, and his unwarranted actions. The evidence was clear. A bystander's video captured the officer taking the inhaler from Laura, leaving her struggling for breath. It was impossible to ignore the officer's disregard for her well-being, and the video spoke volumes. Laura watched as the footage played on the screen, feeling the weight of the memories flood back. She squeezed Marcus's hand tightly, fighting back the tears. She had tried to move on, to heal, but seeing the incident again brought everything rushing back. It was a hard thing to relive, but it was necessary. When it was Marcus's turn to testify, he stood tall, calm but firm. He spoke about the fear and frustration he had felt watching his wife be treated in such a violent way, and he explained the emotional toll it had taken on their family. He spoke of the strength that Laura had shown throughout the ordeal, and how she had not once let the officer's actions define her. But most importantly, he talked about the power of standing up for what's right, no matter the consequences. The defense tried to poke holes in his testimony, claiming that Marcus's anger had clouded his judgment. But Marcus didn't back down. He was there to speak the truth, and he did just that. Every word he spoke was grounded in the reality of what had happened. There was no denying it. As the trial continued, more witnesses came forward. Some were fellow officers who had witnessed the event and confirmed that the officer's actions were unjustified. Others were community members who had seen the officer's history of aggressive behavior. The evidence was mounting against the officer, and it became increasingly difficult for the defense to argue that what had happened was anything but a clear abuse of power. Finally, after several days of intense testimony, the judge called for a recess before delivering the verdict. Marcus and Laura sat together in the courtroom, their hands tightly clasped. They had made it this far, but there was still the uncertainty of what the verdict would be. They had hoped for justice, but they also knew that the system didn't always work in their favor. When the judge returned, the tension in the room was palpable. Everyone was waiting for the final decision. The officer sat in his seat, a nervous look on his face. He knew what was coming. The judge stood up and addressed the room. After reviewing the evidence and hearing the testimonies, it is clear that the actions of Officer Thompson were inappropriate, unprovoked, and unjustified. His treatment of Laura Reynolds was a violation of the duty he swore to uphold. The room was silent for a moment before the judge continued. Officer Thompson is hereby terminated from his position as a police officer. Furthermore, he will face further disciplinary actions as determined by the department. The decision hit like a wave. For Marcus and Laura, the feeling of relief was overwhelming. It wasn't just a win for them. It was a win for everyone who had been wronged by an officer abusing their power. It was a small but important step toward accountability within the law enforcement system. As they left the courtroom, hand in hand, a sense of peace washed over them. They had fought for what was right, and they had prevailed. It had taken strength, courage, and determination, but they had stood up against injustice and made sure that their voices were heard. Marcus turned to Laura, a proud smile on his face. "We did it," he said quietly. Laura nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We did, and this is just the beginning." They walked out of the courthouse, knowing that the fight for justice was far from over. but they were ready for whatever came next. Together, they had proven that no matter what obstacles lay ahead, standing up for what's right was always worth it.